Pardon the break. I had neglected to make space on the hard drive, and the phone filled up. So we've been talking about the evil of imamate, where people overinvest credulity into these individuals. If you criticize the Shia imams, the Shia have a whole metaphysics of these people having isma, being infallible, and they will at best assume you are damned. Now, the Zaydis have a lower imamology where anyone after these first few Ahl Bayt generations is presumably blessed with wisdom, hence their preference for someone in that descendancy, the insistent preference. But nonetheless, they don't think of them as having a prophetic infallibility. And likewise, among Sunnis, if you criticize any of the four sanctioned madhabs, which were picked out in the Mamluk Empire to further canonize and solidify the Sunni epistemology, which was really fleshed out as a reaction to the threat of the Shia epistemology, which was really manifest not with anything 12 or 7er, but rather with the Fatimid Caliphate, which ultimately was overthrown by Salahuddin and then by the Mamluks subsequently. And thus we need to codify this. And it makes sense from a Machiavellian point of view, but it doesn't make sense from, like, the whole point was not to have an ecclesiology. The point of calling someone a scholar is not to say that they are beyond critique, but rather that the whole point of being a scholar is to be subject to peer review and that you can be freely critiqued. And it is this freedom to critique which defines the dialectic of scholarship. And then you can respond to critique. You can do more research. You can make a rebuttal. People can judge the rebuttal as weak, or they can say that the rebuttal has a point, and then they can look into things the rebuttal might refer to rebut its refuters, and so on. And when this is gelled by a lackadaisical deference to tradition, as has also happened in science, this idea, the saying that science advances one funeral at a time, also applies. It's a tendency in human nature. And so when we began to capitalize scholarship and say, well, he's not a real scholar. Sure, he's looking things up and he's writing blog posts or writing a PDF. I didn't publish on Amazon. Someone says I read your PDF. I mean, that is accurate. It was a PDF. It's the format that we prefer. It's a little bit cleaner looking. It reads better than a Word document. And so there's a spectrum. You can be a hobbyist scholar, and you can be a tenured professor who makes maybe $50,000 a year, or something like that, and is chipping away at a mortgage. Of course, mortgages are haram, but if you're an Ismaili Shia, maybe you could do it. So that's not a lot. That would be a good income in where I live, but where I live, professors only make $20,000 a year if they're lucky. So anyway, it's something. It means you don't have to worry about money. You can keep publishing. You keep publishing. You can stay in on this. You don't have to take a break and go back to the dunya and focus on commerce and then build up independent wealth and then fund it. And indeed, this is how people like Abu Hanifa funded themselves. He was, I believe, he was a garment. Maybe that was Imam Malik. But they were both mercantile individuals who then did scholarship in addition to the dunya. And I think there's a lot of merit to that. And on the other hand, I don't dismiss the value of the Shia Imams. I just think that they're not infallible. I have a lower imamology. And it's theologically essential to conceptualize that God is really trying to make this not necessarily easy for us, but doable. He's trying to reward those who are earnest in seeking knowledge and wisdom, and that the guidance comes synchronously from both texts, from um, physical evidence, such as we can draw from the Hubble Space Telescope about the expansion of the sky. We are continually expanding it, as the Quran says. Or, for instance, the work of Ahmad al Jalad, who is finding evidence that people in Arabia were monotheistic and using similar Quranic vocabulary prior to the advent of the Quran, which I don't imagine disproves the Quran in any way, but rather it disproves the messianic, you can only approach God through the Prophet Muhammad alayhi salam, exclusivism, this the negation of Surah Maida's clear statements about multiple covenants that Ibn Kathir does in his tafsir. This is this satanic, corrupt religion, and the physical evidence shows us that this is all this is not reflective of reality, that everyone was just a pagan. Sure, in Mecca they were extremely cosmopolitan, you might say, if you wanted to be charitable, and they had a polytheistic system where all kinds of different figures were honored because it was good for business, and that they were perhaps corrupt and decadent in that city. But in Yemen and in northern Arabia, the inscriptions show that there were monotheistic traditions. And this speaks to the Quran being good news in that it liberates us from tagut in general, from any kind of exclusivist, ecclesial, one way path. The only path is through these men, through these so-called scholars who, if they do any original scholarship in the last 1,000 years, they'll be called a deviant, the way that Mufti Abu Layth has been sidelined. Even though he has the credentials, he outranks a lot of these other personalities. Technically, they're not muftis; they just have ijazas. He went for the PhD. And then you have people like Javad Hashmi getting a PhD from Harvard. And then people say, well, this is a kafir institution. So there's all this special pleading about credentialism. And it's often because people are either not educated enough or intellectual enough, or they are educated and intellectual, but they have extremely strong immune responses intellectually to anything that gives them cognitive dissonance from their subscription to a long codified traditional exclusivist concept of who is a proper Muslim. And then they'll say that Shia are not Muslims and Quranists are not Muslims and so on. And it's really hard, even though as I'll get to in a minute, I'm not a capital Q Quranist, because I don't think taking the Quran alone is really a robust epistemology, because we all read texts through some kind of lens, and if you're not aware of your epistemological foreground, then it will write your tafsir without you knowing its own authorship. You'll assume it's just your own ego or your own or God's guidance. And it may well be a mix of these things, but it's also that you're biased by modernity, and you're biased by a number of things that you may not be aware of. And so we'll dig into that in a minute. But on the other hand, people who say that Quranists are kuffar truly are, I think, condemning themselves, and they're also making Islam look very unserious, because in Christianity you have these Bible only Christians, right? This is a big thing. Sola Scriptura is kind of the core of Western European Protestantism, and they'll argue about it, but they won't say that they're not Christians. They'll just say that they're wrong about some things. And this is a little more serious because we're all rooting on this text, right? So why would following the text without supplements be such a disqualifier? It so well you so then they come to this logic of like, well, the Quran says this and this, and ultimately the people of Medina were castigated if they did not obey all the military commands of the prophet and other